At my mother's funeral, an old woman pressed a folded note into my palm and whispered, "Don't go home tonight. He called his lawyer this morning, before your mother's body was even cold." Before I could turn to find her face, she was gone, swallowed by the crowd of black umbrellas and bowed heads. Then my husband's hand found my shoulder, warm, steady, the way it always was. "You okay, sweetheart?" he murmured against my hair. "You look pale." I smiled, because that's what 4 years of marriage had taught me to do. Magnolia Cemetery sits on the edge of Charleston's historic district, where the oak trees grow so old and wide, they seem to hold the sky up. On a clear day, you can smell the salt water from the harbor 2 miles out. But that Tuesday morning in late October, there was only gray sky, gray mist curling off the grass, gray light filtering through Spanish moss that hung from the branches like old lace. My mother, Eleanor Whitmore, had picked this place herself. Years ago, on a Sunday drive, she'd pointed out the window and said, "That's where I want to be, Claire. Somewhere with good trees." I'd laughed and told her she had decades left. She'd just smiled the way she always did when she knew something I didn't. She was 61 years old. The doctors called it a stroke. I was 31, standing in the rain, watching them lower her casket into the ground and trying to remember how to breathe. There were maybe 40 people gathered, neighbors from Trad Street, old friends of hers from the Historic Preservation Society, a few business associates from the Whitmore real estate portfolio she'd spent 30 years building. They stood in clusters under umbrellas, speaking in that particular hushed tone people use when they're not sure what to say, but feel obligated to say something. My husband stood beside me the entire time. He was dressed perfectly, dark suit tie, just slightly loosened to suggest grief rather than announce it. He'd cried at exactly the right moments during the service. Several of my mother's friends had squeezed his arm and told him what a wonderful son-in-law he was. He'd accepted every word with a modest dip of his chin that I had once found endearing. I noticed, standing there in the wet grass, that I couldn't remember the last time I'd found anything about him endearing. That thought arrived quietly, without drama, like something that had been waiting a long time to be acknowledged. I didn't know the old woman. She appeared at my elbow, somewhere between the pastor's final prayer and the moment when people begin drifting toward their cars, that uncertain in-between time, when grief is still raw, but the formal part is over. She was perhaps 70, small and sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that suggested she had spent decades paying close attention to the world around her. A neighbor, I assumed. My mother had known half of Charleston. She took my hand in both of hers, the gesture of a woman offering condolences, and pressed something into my palm so smoothly that no one watching would have seen the exchange. Then she leaned close enough that I caught the faint scent of lavender, and she said it. "Don't go home tonight. He called his lawyer this morning, before your mother's body was even cold." 4 seconds, maybe 5. Then she released my hand, patted it once, and walked away through the crowd with the unhurried certainty of someone who had somewhere more important to be. I stood very still. The note in my hand was small, the kind torn from a notepad, folded twice. I closed my fingers around it. The women's restroom in the Magnolia Cemetery Chapel smelled like old stone and candle wax. I locked the door, ran cold water over my wrists, the way my mother had taught me to do when I was anxious, and unfolded the note under the single overhead light. 7 words in handwriting I didn't recognize. Careful, deliberate letters, the kind someone writes when they want to make absolutely sure they are understood. "Don't go home. He called his lawyer at 9 a.m. Beneath that, a single initial, M. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it back along its original creases, tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. My eyes were dry. I hadn't been able to cry since the hospital called 4 days ago. Everyone kept telling me the tears would come. Eventually, that grief worked on its own schedule. My husband had held me that first night and said, "Let it out, sweetheart. I'm right here." I hadn't let anything out. I didn't know why. I just knew that something in me had gone very, very quiet. I splashed water on my face, straightened my coat, and walked back out. He was waiting near the chapel door, out of the rain, hands in his pockets. 42 years old, dark-haired, the kind of handsome that photographs well and ages better. A real estate attorney by trade, though in the 4 years of our marriage, he'd spent considerably more time managing my mother's property portfolio than practicing law. She'd invited him in early on, trusted his expertise. He had a way of making people feel like they'd be foolish not to trust him. He fell into step beside me as we walked back toward the gravesite for the final goodbyes. "Feeling any better?" "A little," I said. The cold air helped. He nodded, slipped an arm around my shoulders, and we walked together across the wet grass. His grip was warm, familiar, and just slightly, so slightly, that anyone watching would never have noticed tighter than it needed to be. I kept my hand in my coat pocket, my fingers resting lightly against the folded note. The burial was over. The crowd was thinning. He stayed close as we said our goodbyes, close enough that I could feel the solid weight of him beside me. With every conversation, every hug, every murmured, "I'm so sorry for your loss." We were almost to the car when he spoke again, his voice easy and warm, the same tone he used to ask what I wanted for dinner. "That older woman who came to speak to you, the one in the gray coat. Do you know her?" I kept walking, kept my expression soft, kept my voice exactly as tired and sad as it should have been. "Just a neighbor, I think. I didn't really recognize her." He said. Nothing more. But when I glanced up at him, his mouth was curved into the familiar shape of his smile. His eyes were doing something else entirely. The drive home took 11 minutes. I know because I counted not the miles, not the turns, but the minutes. It was something to do with my mind, while the rest of me sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, hands folded in my lap, watching Charleston slide past the window in streaks of wet gray and amber streetlight. He drove the way he always did, one hand on the wheel, unhurried, radio low, comfortable, like a man with nothing on his conscience and nowhere he'd rather be. 11 minutes. I had memorized the route so completely over 4 years that I could have driven it in my sleep. But that evening, for the first time, I paid attention to every turn. Our house on King Street is the kind of place that makes people pause on the sidewalk. 3 stories of pre-Civil War architecture restored to something close to its original bones, wide plank floors, 12-foot ceilings, a deep front porch lined with rocking chairs that we never actually used. My mother had helped us find it. She'd walked through every room twice, pressed her palm flat against the plaster walls, the way she did when she was deciding whether a property had good bones, and then looked at me and said, "This one, Claire, this one has staying power." Walking through the front door that evening, I understood for the first time that a house and the life inside it are 2 entirely different things. He took my coat at the door, hung it carefully on the rack in the entryway, the same rack he'd hung it on 1,000 times before. Then he moved to the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew exactly where everything was, because he had made sure, over the course of 4 years, to always be the one who put things in their place. "Tea," he called. "Please," I said. I sat down at the kitchen table and watched him. Really watched him. Not the way a wife watches a husband she trusts, but the way you watch something when you're trying to understand how it works. The set of his shoulders, the way he filled the kettle without looking at the faucet, his eyes already moving to his phone on the counter. The small private expression that crossed his face when he read whatever was on the screen there, and gone in less than a second, replaced immediately by the pleasant, neutral look he wore the way other men wore a watch. Always there, always composed, always just slightly more aware of the room than anyone needed to be. The kettle began to heat. He put his phone face down on the counter. He set the mug in front of me with both hands, the way he always did, a small gesture that had always read as attentive, considerate. The tea was the kind my mother used to keep in her cabinet, chamomile with a spoonful of honey. He'd started making it for me after her diagnosis 6 months ago. For the stress, he'd said. It'll help you sleep. I wrapped both hands around the mug. The steam rose in a thin curl between us. I did not drink it. Not because I made a decision not to. There was no dramatic internal moment, no sudden clarity. It was smaller than that. I simply sat there, with the warmth against my palms, and realized, in the way you realize something that has always been true, that I had never once, in 4 years of marriage, declined anything he offered me. Not a drink, not a suggestion, not an explanation that didn't quite add up. He offered, and I accepted. That was the architecture of us so familiar, I had never thought to examine the foundation. I set the mug down, after a few minutes, tilted just enough to look used. I think I need to lie down, I said. He looked up from the counter with an expression of such practiced concern that I felt something shift in my chest, not breaking exactly. More like a door swinging open onto a room I hadn't known was there. Of course, he said. I'll be up soon. Try to rest. The upstairs bathroom was the one space in the house that had always felt like mine. Small, white-tiled, a window that looked out over the back garden. I ran cold water and pressed my wrists under the tap, a habit my mother had given me for the moments when the world felt like too much. Then I opened the medicine cabinet. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. It was automatic the way you check a familiar space without thinking. The cabinet held the usual inventory, his things on the left, mine on the right, the arrangement we'd settled into without ever discussing it. Antacids, allergy tablets, a mostly finished bottle of ibuprofen, and on my side, tucked behind the ibuprofen, where I wouldn't have noticed it unless I was looking directly at it, a prescription bottle I had never seen before. My name was on the label. The prescribing physician was listed as someone I didn't recognize. The medication was a sleep aid, a specific kind, the sort a doctor might prescribe for what the label delicately called acute situational anxiety. I stood there for a moment, reading the label twice. I had not been to a doctor in 4 months. I had not complained of trouble sleeping to anyone other than I stopped, set the bottle back exactly as I'd found it, closed the cabinet, looked at my own reflection for 3 full seconds without expression. Then I went to bed. He came upstairs an hour later. I kept my breathing slow and even until I heard the particular rhythm of his sleep, deep, unhesitating, the sleep of a man who had done everything on his list for the day. I lay in the dark with my eyes open and my hands still at my sides, and I thought about my mother. She had taken the same blood pressure medication every morning for 20 years. Rain travel holidays? It didn't matter. She set it out the night before, next to a glass of water, and she took it every single morning, without exception, because she said her own mother had passed from exactly the kind of thing that medication was meant to prevent. It was the most consistent thing about her, more reliable than her calendar or her coffee order. I had been inside her house twice in the weeks before she passed. I had seen her kitchen counter, her bathroom shelf. I had never once seen her medication set out. I stared at the ceiling and felt the darkness of the room press in from all sides, and I told myself there was probably a simple explanation. People forgot things. People got out of their routines when they were unwell. But my mother didn't. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, quiet and certain as a compass, finding north, a single thought settled into place. I haven't checked her medicine cabinet. Charleston, in early morning, has a particular quality of light, soft, and slightly gold, the kind that makes everything look gentler than it is. He had left for his 8 o'clock meeting at 6:45, pressed a kiss to my forehead while I pretended to be half asleep. The front door clicked shut. I was dressed and in my car 6 minutes later. My mother's house on Trad Street was a narrow Charleston single, built sideways to the street, a long piazza running the south-facing wall to catch the harbor breeze. She'd raised my younger sister and me inside its plaster walls and heart pine floors, filling every room with botanical prints, mismatched china, and the smell of good coffee and old books. Standing on the front porch with my key in the lock, I had the irrational feeling she was about to open the door before I could. She didn't. The house breathed out, its familiar smell, lavender and lemon oil, and something underneath that was just her, and I went straight upstairs. Her bathroom shelf held what she called her morning lineup: Cotton Rounds moisturizer reading glasses, and the prescription bottle, the one she'd taken every single morning for 20 years, the small tablets her cardiologist called non-negotiable. 30 tablets in a 30-day supply, 28 remaining. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and did the math I didn't want to do. 2 tablets in her final month. My mother, who had once called me from a cruise ship in the Caribbean to confirm her refill, was waiting at home, had taken her medication exactly twice in the last 30 days of her life, which meant something else had taken its place. I went to my car and sat with my hands in my lap and made myself remember the things I had chosen very deliberately not to think about. The first was my younger sister, Diane. 2 years ago, she called me from her car. I could tell by the careful way she chose her words, like someone watching their footing on uneven ground. "Something is off about him," she said. "The way he tracks your movements in conversations without appearing to. The way the subject changes whenever I try to talk to you alone." I told her she was misreading things, that he was protective, not controlling. 3 weeks later, she told me she was relocating to the West Coast. At the airport, she held on a beat longer than usual and said into my shoulder, "Call me the second anything feels wrong." I promised. I never called. The second was her doctor. 14 months ago, my mother's physician, a careful man who had managed her care for over a decade, called my cell on a Thursday evening. A personal call. He said he needed to speak with me privately, without anyone else present. I mentioned it at dinner. He set down his fork with an expression of such gentle patience that I felt almost embarrassed for bringing it up. "Doctors sometimes overstep with older patients," he said. "I'm happy to come with you if it makes you feel better." The appointment was scheduled. Then, quietly canceled the office, left a message saying the doctor was reorganizing his practice. I never heard from him again. I had accepted that so completely, I hadn't thought about it since. Until now. The third came 6 months ago, on a Sunday morning while he was in the shower. His jacket was on the back of the chair. I was moving it to hang it up, nothing more than that, when something shifted in the inside pocket. A small prescription bottle, no name I recognized on the label. When he came downstairs, I asked about it easily. The way you ask about something, you expect to have a simple answer. He told me it was something he'd been helping manage for my mother, a supplement her cardiologist had recently added. She'd been forgetful about taking it, he said, so he'd been keeping it with him to make sure she didn't miss a dose. He said it with such obvious care for her well-being that I thanked him. I thanked him. The memory sat in my chest now, like a stone. I am not a naive person. I have a graduate degree, a career I built without anyone's help, and a mother who raised me to ask questions. I had not missed these moments because I lacked the ability to see them. I had missed them because I loved him. Because when someone shares your home in the small daily rhythms of your life, trust becomes so structural, so load-bearing, that the mind resists examining it. The same way you don't question whether the floor will hold you every time you take a step. You simply walk. I had simply walked for 4 years. I got out of the car. The morning was still quiet, still golden, still entirely indifferent to everything that had just rearranged itself inside me. I walked around the side of the house, to the back garden entrance, the narrow gate my mother used when she came home from the farmer's market. Arms full, keys already in hand. The gate was unlocked. Normal. The door beyond it was not. The old deadbolt brass, original to the house, slightly worn from decades of use, had been replaced. What was there now was silver and clean and completely unfamiliar, the kind that required a key I did not have. I stood very still and looked at it for a long moment. Someone had been inside my mother's house, and they had made sure I couldn't follow them in. The front door was the one they hadn't touched. The same deadbolt my mother had installed the year she moved in, and the spare key still in the small ceramic dish on her kitchen windowsill, underneath the rosemary cutting she'd been growing for 11 years. I let myself in, stood in the entryway, and listened. Nothing moved. The morning light came through the sidelights in long, pale rectangles across the floor, and the whole place had the stillness of a home that knows its owner isn't coming back. I went upstairs with the kind of focus that arrives when emotion has nowhere left to go, when you've used up the part of yourself that feels, and only the part that moves remains. Her bedroom, third door turn left. My mother wasn't a sentimental decorator. She kept things that were beautiful and useful and meant something, which is why the painting above her dresser had always stood out, a harbor scene, Charleston from the water, soft blues and grays, boats in the middle distance. She'd bought it at an estate sale before I was born and hung it in every bedroom she'd ever had since. When I was 10, I asked her why she kept it. She looked at it for a moment and said, "Some things you keep not because they're valuable. You keep them because they remind you of what you're working toward." I crossed the room and lifted it off the wall. The safe was recessed into the plaster behind it. Small combination operated. I hadn't known it was there, or rather, I had known the way you know things about a childhood home without ever examining them. Her birthday, then mine. On the second attempt, the mechanism released with a soft click that sounded in the silence of that room very loud. Inside a white envelope with my name in her handwriting. A small, red USB drive. A thick manila folder labeled Medical Confidential. And beneath everything, a plain business card, Ray Coulter, private investigator. I sat on the edge of her bed and opened the letter first. 3 pages, front and back. In her precise and slightly slanted hand, the penmanship of a woman who had learned to write when people still cared about such things. Cream stationery, small EW monogram at the top. She had chosen every word. She had begun to notice something was wrong 18 months ago. Numbers that didn't add up. Conversations she wasn't included in that she should have been. A quiet sense that the person she'd trusted with her affairs was operating according to an agenda she hadn't been shown. She didn't come to me. She'd considered it had written a letter she ultimately didn't send, but she was afraid I wouldn't believe her. That I would bring it to him the way I'd brought him Dr. Haynes' phone call without thinking twice, and whatever small window of safety she had would close. Instead, she found Ray Coulter, through a friend she trusted absolutely. Met him in person, paid in cash, and spent the following 14 months building what she called, with characteristic precision, the case. "I knew what he was doing to me," she wrote. "I knew for a long time. I chose to stay, because leaving would have put you in the position I was in, alone with him, without any of what I was building. I needed time. I thought I had more of it than I did. I stopped reading, looked up at the window. Outside, a mockingbird started up in the garden, the same one, maybe, that had nested in her crepe myrtle every spring for years. She used to leave water out for it in a shallow dish. I wondered if anyone had thought to do that since she'd been gone. I made myself continue. She wrote about Ray, his background, her confidence in what he'd gathered. She wrote about the Whitmore Trust, restructured 16 months ago, with a private attorney, his name appearing nowhere in the document chain. She wrote with the dry pragmatism that had always been her most distinctive quality, walking me through the situation the way she used to walk me through a difficult decision, step by step, without drama. Every piece in its proper place. And then near the bottom of the second page, her tone shifted. It became quieter, the way a voice drops when it finally says the thing it's been working up to. "I tried to protect you by staying quiet and building the case. I watched you from closer than you knew, and I want you to understand something. None of this is your fault. You love someone the way a good person loves completely. Without reservation, he counted on that. That is his failure, not yours. And then, I'm sorry it wasn't enough to stay alive." I sat with that sentence for a long moment. The mockingbird was still going outside. The harbor painting leaned against the dresser, where I'd left it Charleston, from the water, soft blues and grays. The thing she'd kept in every room she'd ever lived in, because it reminded her of what she was working toward. I understood, finally, what she'd been working toward. I turned to the last page. Most of it was instructions, ordered and practical, the kind of list she made when she wanted to make sure nothing was forgotten. Call Ray from a phone that couldn't be connected to my regular accounts. Review the medical file before anything else. Keep the USB somewhere safe. And then underlined once at the very bottom, check the medical file. Then check your vitamins, the ones he bought you last month. Don't take any more of them until you do. I looked at the folder in my lap, at the red drive on the bedspread beside me, at the plain white card with its 2 quiet words. Then I opened the medical file. The medical file was not what I expected. I don't know what I had expected, exactly. Something vague and difficult to interpret, perhaps. Medical language designed to obscure rather than reveal. What I found instead was a single sheet at the front of the folder, printed on the letterhead of a private laboratory with my mother's name at the top and a date from 3 weeks before she passed. It was a blood work panel, comprehensive, detailed, and in the margin, beside one particular result, someone Ray, I assumed, or perhaps my mother herself, had written a single word in red pen. 8. The resulting question was for a substance found in her system at a concentration 8 times higher than any legitimate therapeutic dose, a substance commonly used in controlled amounts to support cardiovascular health. In the amount present in my mother's blood, it would have done the opposite thinning what ran through her veins so aggressively that the eventual outcome would have looked to any physician who hadn't thought to look deeper, exactly like the kind of sudden neurological event that takes people in their 60s. The doctors had called it a stroke. They had been correct about what happened. They had simply never asked why. I set the folder down and picked up the red USB drive. My mother's laptop was on her desk, by the window. She'd never liked working anywhere else, always said she needed to see the garden while she thought. I opened it, found it unlocked, and plugged in the drive. 14 months of files. Organized the way she organized everything, by date, clearly labeled, nothing ambiguous. I opened the earliest folder first and worked forward. The first several months were screenshots. Bank transfers, wire, confirmations. Correspondence between an LLC I didn't recognize and a series of property management accounts I recognized very well. They were ours. The Whitmore portfolio. Transactions moving in directions. They had no legitimate reason to move amounts that would have been invisible against the larger picture unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. She had known what she was looking for. The later folders contained contracts, 7 of them spanning the past 18 months, each one involving a Whitmore property in some stage of transfer or encumbrance. I opened the first one and went directly to the signature page. My name, my signature, or something that wore my signature like a borrowed coat. The loops slightly too even, the pressure slightly too consistent. The particular way I crossed the second letter of my last name, just slightly, off in a way I couldn't have articulated but recognized immediately. The way you recognize a photograph of yourself, taken without your knowledge. I had not signed any of these documents. I sat at my mother's desk for a long moment, looking at my own name, written in someone else's hand, and felt something settle into place in my chest, cold and heavy, and underneath the cold and the weight clarifying. The way a fever breaks, the way fog lifts off the harbor on a morning when the wind finally comes in off the water. I closed the laptop, pocketed the USB drive, and left. The drive back across town felt longer than it was. I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, and did not let myself think past the next immediate thing, which was the vitamin bottle in our upstairs bathroom. The house was quiet when I got home. His car wasn't in the drive. I went straight upstairs, opened the cabinet, and took the bottle down from the shelf where I'd found it the night before. White capsules. No manufacturer's name. No lot number. No information on the label beyond my name, a dosage, instruction, and the name of a prescribing physician I had already established I had never seen. I turned the bottle in my hands, shook it once lightly, and listened to the rattle of however many capsules remained inside. My mother's letter had been precise. Don't take any more until you do this. She hadn't explained further. She hadn't needed to. Standing there in the bathroom with the bottle in my hand, the medical file still fresh in my mind, I understood exactly what she meant without needing it spelled out. I put the bottle in my coat pocket. Then I went to the kitchen, found the prepaid phone I'd bought that morning at the gas station on Rutledge Avenue, and dialed the number from Ray Coulter's card. He answered on the second ring. "I've been waiting for your call," he said. His voice was unhurried, the particular calm of someone accustomed to receiving calls like this one. "Are you on a cell right now?" "A prepaid," I said. "I bought it this morning." "Good. Keep using that one, not your regular phone for anything related to this. Are you somewhere you can talk?" "I'm alone." "All right." A brief pause, and I had the sense of a man quickly recalibrating moving pieces into position. "Waterfront Park. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. The bench at the north end facing the bridge. Come alone, and don't tell anyone where you're going." "Okay," I said. "Claire." He used my name carefully, like something with weight. "You did the right thing calling. Your mother wanted to make sure you'd have what you needed. I think she knew you would figure it out." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. We ended the call. I was still standing in the kitchen, the prepaid phone in one hand and the vitamin bottle in the other, when I heard the front door open, his footsteps in the entryway. The particular sound of him setting his keys in the dish by the door. The same dish, the same sound, 1,000 evenings of it. Then, his steps on the stairs, easy and unhurried, and his voice a moment before his face appeared in the doorway. "You're home." I turned around, kept my expression soft, my shoulders loose, the vitamin bottle still in my hand, because putting it down quickly would have been worse than simply holding it. His eyes went to the bottle, then back to my face. He smiled, warm, familiar, the smile I had once waited for at the end of every day. "What are you looking at, sweetheart?" "Just checking if I'm running low," I said. The words came out easily, more easily than I expected. Casual slightly distracted the tone of someone whose mind is elsewhere. I set the bottle back on the shelf with the unhurried movement of a person who has just answered a question that didn't interest her very much, and turned toward the mirror as though I'd come upstairs for something else entirely. He stood in the doorway for a moment. I watched his reflection without appearing to the small, almost imperceptible recalibration that crossed his face before his expression settled back into something easy and warm. "We should probably get you a refill soon," he said. "Don't want you running out." "I'll add it to the list," I said. He nodded and moved down the hall toward the bathroom. I listened to the water start. Then I went to the bedroom, sat on my side of the bed, and took my mother's letter out of my coat pocket for the second time. I had read it through twice already, once in her bedroom, once in the car, on the way home, both times moving quickly. The way you move through something when part of you is still bracing for the impact. This time, I read slowly, deliberately, the way she would have wanted me to read it. The first 2 pages covered what I already knew, Ray, the timeline, the documents she'd assembled. I moved through them carefully, checking my understanding against my memory, making sure I hadn't missed anything. Then I reached the 3rd page. I had skimmed it earlier, stopped at the line that had taken the air out of the room and hadn't gone back. Now I read the full paragraph that followed. She had restructured the Whitmore Family Trust 16 months ago. She wrote about it the way she wrote about everything, practical, clearly, without fanfare, as though she were walking me through the terms of a property lease, rather than the architecture of a plan she had built in secret, while her own health was being quietly dismantled. She had engaged a trust attorney she'd worked with years before my marriage, someone who had no existing relationship with him, someone who communicated only through a post office box she'd opened under her maiden name. Every asset, the house on Trad Street, the King Street properties, the Whitmore building on East Bay, the portfolio she had spent 30 years building from a single rental unit, and an inheritance she'd stretched further than anyone had expected, all of it inside the trust. His name appeared nowhere in the document chain. Not as a beneficiary, not as a trustee, not as a person with any legal relationship to a single square foot of Whitmore real estate. She had written, "He married you, thinking he would eventually have access to everything. The answer is that he gets nothing. Not $1, not one property, not one share, unless you choose to sign it over to him voluntarily. I have made certain of that. And I know my daughter. I know you won't." I set the letter down on the bedspread, looked at the wall across from me. It was painted the color he had chosen when we moved, in a warm grayish. He'd called it the shade that photographed well and made the room feel expensive. I had agreed because it looked fine, and I hadn't cared strongly either way. I had agreed to a lot of things that way. My mother had spent 16 months working in secret, 16 months of private meetings and post office boxes and careful, methodical document work, all of it conducted while she continued to host Sunday dinners and attend Preservation Society meetings and smile at him across the table at family holidays. 16 months of carrying the full weight of what she knew alone, because she believed correctly that bringing me into it too early would put us both at risk. And for some portion of those 16 months, she had known that what was in her morning glass of water was not what it was supposed to be. She had known, and she had stayed, because the work wasn't finished, because I wasn't protected yet, because she had decided that my safety was worth more than whatever time she was spending to secure it. I pressed my fingers against my eyes and held them there for a moment. I had spent 4 years thinking my mother didn't fully trust my judgment, that her occasional pointed silences and careful questions about our finances were the habits of an overprotective parent who didn't know how to let go. I had on more than one occasion said as much to him, and he had listened with such patient understanding, had agreed so gently that it was difficult for mothers to accept their daughters growing up, that I had felt grateful for his perspective. He had used my own impatience with her against me, and she had known that too. She had known, and she had kept building anyway. I heard the bathroom door open, his footsteps in the hall, easy, unhurried, the sound of a man moving through a house he considered his. I folded the letter along its original creases, slid it back into my coat pocket, and was looking at my phone with the expression of someone checking the time when he appeared in the bedroom doorway. He looked comfortable, freshly showered, dressed for an easy evening at home, the particular looseness in his posture that meant he considered the day resolved. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen 1 second, maybe 2, and something shifted in the quality of his attention, the way it does when a person receives information that requires immediate processing. He picked it up, looked at me with an easy smile. "1 second, he said. "Work thing." He stepped into the hallway. Then, after a moment, down the stairs toward the kitchen, far enough I understood that the conversation wouldn't carry. I sat very still and listened. The house was old enough that sound traveled in particular ways. Certain spots in the floor, certain angles of the stairwell, had always been more acoustically generous than others. From where I sat on the edge of the bed, I could hear the low register of his voice, but not the words. Then a pause. Then 3 phrases that arrived with the specific clarity of something the house had decided I needed to hear. "Yes, she suspects nothing." A pause.
"Now move forward."
The call lasted 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my phone without appearing to move at all. When he came back upstairs, his expression was exactly as it had been when he left. Pleasant, relaxed, the face of a man with nothing to account for. He set his phone on the nightstand, rolled his shoulders once, and looked at me with the easy warmth of 11 minutes in the car and 4 years of practice. "Work stuff," he said. "Nothing that can't wait until morning." He tilted his head slightly. "Ready for bed?" I looked up at him, put a small, tired smile on my face, the kind that said, "Long day, grateful you're here, ready for this one to be over." "Yeah," I said. "I think so." He smiled back. I held his gaze and felt the cold move through me, like weather quiet, total, and absolutely certain. He had been asleep by the time I turned off my bedside lamp. I lay in the dark until around 2 in the morning, and somewhere in that stillness, I made a decision that felt less like a decision and more like an acknowledgement of something already settled. I was at Waterfront Park by 6:45. The Cooper River runs wide and dark. At that hour, the surface moving with the tide, the far bank lost in low mist that settles in before the sun burns it away. A few joggers on the path, a man walking a retriever along the seawall, the distant sound of a container ship finding its way through the channel. Ray Coulter was already on the bench when I arrived. He was the kind of man you wouldn't look at twice on the street, which I suspected was deliberate. Mid-50s, solidly built, a weathered face that suggested years in difficult rooms. Plain jacket paper, coffee cup. The easy posture of someone with nowhere pressing to be. His eyes, when he turned to look at me, told a different story. The kind of eyes that have spent decades watching people and remembering exactly what they saw. "You're early," he said. "So are you," I said. He almost smiled. "Your mother did the same thing. Said she didn't trust anyone who showed up exactly on time." He reached into his jacket and set a manila envelope on the bench between us. "She hired me 14 months ago. Cash every 2 weeks, different location, each time her idea. I thought she was being overly cautious." A pause. "I stopped thinking that about 3 months in." The envelope held a 4-page summary, plain language, chronological, written to be used rather than merely read. I understood as I went through it that my mother had asked him to write it that way. For me, for this moment. The man I married was not who I thought he was. His legal name was Ethan Marsh. The name on our marriage license had been constructed 7 years ago. A legal name change, a relocated paper trail, the kind of thing that isn't illegal in itself, but becomes something else entirely when you understand the reason for it. The reason was Rebecca. Rebecca Marsh had been his first wife. They'd married in Savannah when he was 32, and 11 months later, she was gone. Found at home on a Tuesday morning, a bottle of sleep aids on the nightstand. Everything arranged to suggest a troubled woman had made a final and private decision. The investigation was brief. The conclusion matched the appearance. He inherited $280,000 and a condominium. Both were gone within 4 months. "The second marriage was in Colombia," Ray said. His voice carried the flatness of a man who has learned to deliver hard information without inflection. "Her name was Sarah Connolly. 14 months. Sarah had assets, but they were structured in ways that made rapid transfer difficult. The marriage ended before he could navigate them. It ended on the Cooper River Bridge. An incident report, single vehicle accident, wet road, a guardrail that didn't hold. Sarah Connolly survived, but sustained injuries that left her unable to walk without assistance. No evidence of third-party involvement. He left Colombia within 3 weeks. The legal process he'd initiated to access her accounts had stalled, and whatever he'd been working toward had become unreachable. So he had simply become someone else and started over." Ray produced a photograph, long lens, slightly grainy, a man on the sidewalk outside a gallery on King Street. The grand opening banner was visible in the window. The date printed at the bottom was 2 weeks before the evening I walked in and met a charming stranger through a mutual acquaintance. The man in the photograph had his hands in his pockets and was studying the entrance with the focused attention of someone conducting a careful survey. I recognized his posture before I fully registered his face. "He was there at least 2 weeks before you met him," Ray said. "The introduction through your acquaintance was arranged." "I've confirmed that." I set the photograph down and looked out at the river. The mist was beginning to lift the bridge, coming visible in sections. First the near tower, then the cables, then the long arch reaching toward the far bank. The Cooper River Bridge. I had driven across it without thinking 100 times. I thought about it now. Ray let the silence settle before he continued. When he spoke again, his voice dropped, not for effect, just the natural adjustment of a man choosing words he'd been organizing for a long time. "Sarah Connolly dropped out of sight after the accident. No forwarding address, no active accounts I could trace. I've been trying to find her for 14 months. He turned to look at me directly. "I believe she's still out there. And if she is, She's the only person who has ever been exactly where you are right now and come out the other side. Whatever she knows, it's the piece of this your mother couldn't reach. He set his empty cup on the bench beside him. Find her before he realizes you're looking Claire. She's the only one who's looked him in the eye and walked away. Ray had given me one address, the last known location he'd been able to trace before the trail went quiet. A street in West Ashley, across the river from the historic district, in the kind of neighborhood that doesn't show up in travel guides. Modest houses, small yards, the occasional live oak, spreading wide over the sidewalk. The sort of place a person goes when they want to be left alone and have enough experience with the world to know exactly how to arrange that. I found the house without difficulty. Ground floor unit, a small ramp built alongside the front steps. Recently installed the wood, still pale and unstained. A single window with the blinds half open. A pot of rosemary on the railing trim and well tended. I knocked and waited. The woman who opened the door was 36 years old, though she looked both younger and older than that simultaneously, younger in her face, which was sharp-featured and unguarded in the way of someone who has stopped performing ease for strangers, and older in her eyes, which carried the particular quality of a person who has spent years in a room with difficult knowledge and learned to live alongside it. She sat in a manual wheelchair, her posture, straight shoulders squared, one hand resting on the wheel with the relaxed authority of someone entirely at home in the space she occupied. Dark hair cut short, no jewelry, the kind of stillness that isn't passive. She looked at me for a moment without surprise. "I wondered when you'd show up," she said. She let me in without further preamble, the way people do when they've been expecting something for long enough that the actual arrival is almost a relief. The apartment was small and orderly, books on every flat surface, a desk by the window with a laptop and several stacked folders, a corkboard on the wall, covered in printed photographs and handwritten notes, connected by lengths of colored string. I looked at the corkboard without meaning to. Several of the photographs were of him. 4 years, she said, following my gaze. Sit down. I'll tell you what I know, and then you can tell me what you have, and between the two of us, we'll figure out what comes next. She told it plainly, without the careful, self-protective hedging I might have expected from someone who had spent years not being believed. They had married in Colombia, she a property manager, with a modest but solid portfolio. He a man who had arrived in her life with impeccable timing and an easy charm she'd later understand was a professional skill. 14 months in this marriage had reached the point where he needed to move quickly on her assets, or accept that the structure she'd built made them inaccessible. She had started to see the edges of things, by then small inconsistencies, explanations that required her to trust his account over her own memory. They argued about it in the car, crossing the bridge on a night when the roads were wet and the river was running fast below. She said she remembered the moment of impact, and then nothing until the hospital. "I came around in the recovery room," she said. "There was a window. He was outside in the corridor, talking to someone, an officer, I think, and he looked up." She paused. Not for effect, just taking the space the memory required. "He saw me watching him through the glass, and for about 1 second, before his face did what it always did, he smiled." She said it the way you say something you have repeated to yourself so many times, it has become almost abstract, the words worn smooth, the meaning underneath them still entirely intact. Nobody believed me. He was so good in that hospital room. Flowers every day, held my hand in front of the nurses. By the time I was well enough to push back the paperwork had been untangled and he was already gone. She crossed to the desk and lifted a shoebox from the lower shelf, setting it in her lap and bringing it over to where I sat. Inside, printed bank records, photographs, taken from a distance, a small digital recorder, handwritten logs in a compact, precise script. "I couldn't walk after what he did," she said, setting the box on the cushion beside me. "But I could watch, and I could wait." She had tracked him from West Ashley, For 4 years, monitoring property records, following financial filings, building a picture of what he was and what he intended. She had watched him become Ethan Webb. She had watched him find my mother's portfolio. She had watched him find me. I didn't come forward, she said, because I had nothing that would hold in a room with his lawyers. I needed someone on the inside, someone he hadn't finished with yet. She looked at me steadily. I think that's you. The silence that followed was the kind that asks something of you. Did he ever explain something away? She said. That felt wrong when he said it. Something your gut caught before your brain did, and you let it go, because it was easier than pulling the thread. I opened my mouth to answer, and found I couldn't, because the answer was yes. The answer was yes, a dozen times over, going back further than I had let myself acknowledge. Small moments, quiet contradictions, explanations. I had accepted, not because they were convincing, but because the alternative required a kind of courage I hadn't known I needed yet. I had not cried since the hospital called 4 days ago. I had not cried at the service, or at the graveside, or in my mother's bathroom with the pill bottle in my hand. I cried now, quietly, without drama, the way things release when they've been held too long. Sarah didn't move toward me or away. She simply waited with the patience of someone who understands that some things need to complete themselves. And when I pressed the back of my hand against my eyes and steadied my breathing, she nodded once as though something had been confirmed. Whatever you're planning, she said, you need to move carefully. He has a sense for when the ground is shifting under him. I don't know how to explain it better than that. He's been one step ahead of everyone who's ever tried to get close to the truth. She turned her chair slightly toward the window, looking out at the quiet street. You have maybe 72 hours before he starts to feel it, before something in him says the situation has changed. She turned back. Whatever you're going to do, it has to be done before that. The drive back across the bridge took 12 minutes. I spent them doing what I had trained myself to do over the past 3 days, keeping my hands steady on the wheel, my face arranged into something neutral, my mind sorted into the part that was allowed to feel things, and the part that needed to function. By the time I turned onto King Street, the functioning part was firmly in charge. His car was in the drive. The kitchen light was on. I could smell dinner before I opened the front door, something with garlic and rosemary. One of the 3 or 4 meals he rotated through when he wanted the evening to feel domestic and uncomplicated. He was at the stove when I came in, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a dish towel over one shoulder, and he turned when he heard me, with the easy smile of a man entirely at home in his own kitchen. There you are, he said. I wasn't sure how long you'd be. How are you feeling? Better, I said. The air helped. Good. He turned back to the stove. 10 minutes. I set my bag down, hung up my coat, and sat at the kitchen table and watched him move around the room with the fluid confidence of someone who has never once doubted his place in it. He asked about my afternoon in the mild, interested way of a man performing attentiveness, not probing, just present enough to seem caring. I answered in the mild, tired way of a grieving woman who had spent the day walking and thinking and hadn't arrived anywhere in particular. We ate dinner. He poured wine. He told me about a property negotiation he'd been managing, something involving a disputed easement on the south end of the peninsula, and I listened and asked a question at the right moment and watched his hands on the table and thought about almost nothing at all. It was from the outside an entirely ordinary evening. He was asleep by 9:15. I lay beside him in the dark for 30 minutes, watching the ceiling and listening to the rhythm of his breathing settle into the deep, untroubled pattern I had come to know as well as my own. Then I took the prepaid phone from its place in the inside pocket of my coat, slipped out of bed without sound, and went to the bathroom. Ray answered before the second ring. I've been waiting, he said. Are you somewhere private? Bathroom, door locked. All right. A pause. The brief, weighted kind that precedes information that changes things. Claire, I need you to listen to all of this before you respond. I sat down on the edge of the tub. Go ahead. What he told me arrived in pieces, each one rearranging the shape of everything that had come before it. 3 days before my mother's funeral, while I was still at the hospital, making arrangements and signing forms, someone had entered our home on King Street and installed a series of small recording devices, cameras in the practical sense, though Ray used the clinical language of his profession throughout. Living room, kitchen, the upstairs hallway, one positioned with a direct line of sight to the master bedroom doorway. All of them active, all of them transmitting. "He has watched everything," Ray said. "The night you didn't drink the tea, the morning you went to your mother's house. He saw you come home with the medical file. He saw you with the vitamin bottle when he came upstairs. I did not move. He let you find it, Claire. The safe, the letter, the documents on the drive, he knew where all of it was. He needed you to find it." "Why?" I said. It wasn't quite a question. Because a woman who breaks into her mother's house, retrieves hidden documents, and starts carrying prescription bottles around and making calls on unregistered phones is a woman who is not behaving rationally. That's not my characterization. That's the language in the filing his attorney submitted to the family court this morning. The filing, I made myself breathe. "He's petitioning for legal guardianship over your financial affairs," Ray continued, "on the grounds that your mother's passing has resulted in a period of acute psychological instability. The hearing is scheduled for 72 hours from now." He let that land. "Everything you've done in the past 3 days, every document you've touched, every call you've made, every moment you've spent looking like a woman who suspects her husband has been recorded and is currently in the hands of his legal team. He didn't try to stop you from finding the evidence. He needed you to find it. The evidence was never meant to be yours." I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink. The woman looking back at me was tired and still, and underneath both of those things, something else. Something that had been building without my full awareness since the moment a stranger pressed a folded note into my palm at a graveside. He thought I was falling apart. He had watched me for 3 days and concluded reasonably, based on everything he'd seen, that I was frightened and reactive and moving without a plan. He had filed his paperwork from that position of confidence. He was waiting for me to finish unraveling so he could step in and take what he'd come for. That confidence was the only leverage I had, and the only way to keep it was to make sure he went on having it. "Ray," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, not shaken, just low. "I need 24 hours to rebuild from the beginning. Everything he's seen me do, I need to use it instead of lose it." A breath. "Can you get me a contact at the federal level? Someone outside the local jurisdiction." A silence on the other end, the particular silence of a man recalculating. "Your mother," he said finally. "Already thought of that." I held the phone for a moment. After we ended the call, sitting on the edge of the bathtub with the tile cold through my socks and the house completely quiet around me. Then I stood up, set my expression, and opened the bathroom door. He was in the hallway, not moving, just standing in the dark, about 6 feet from the door, the way a person stands when they've been there for a while. He was holding a glass of water, and when the light from the bathroom fell across his face, he looked sleepy and mild and entirely unalarmed. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. Not a question. "I brought you some water. Thought you might need it." He held out the glass. I looked at it, then up at him, and smiled. "I slept 4 hours. Not well, not deeply. The kind of sleep that sits on the surface of things, where you're aware enough of the room around you to know that nothing has changed, and unconscious enough to let your body recover anyway. When the gray light started coming through the curtains, I was already awake, lying still, listening to his breathing beside me. Slow, even. The sleep of a man who had done everything on his list. I got up first. The kitchen in the early morning had always been his domain. He was the one who set the coffee going, who knew where the filters were kept and how many scoops the machine needed, who had established, without discussion, the small domestic choreography that meant I arrived downstairs to something already prepared. I had accepted that arrangement the way I'd accepted most things. It was easier. It felt like care. I filled the machine, found the filters in the cabinet where they'd always been, and had 2 mugs on the counter by the time I heard him on the stairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. The pause was brief, half a second, maybe less, but I had spent 4 days learning to read the small adjustments in his expression, and I caught it. A flicker of something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite displeasure, but existed in the narrow space between the two. Then he smiled. "You're up early?" "Couldn't stay in bed," I said. "Hope I made it right." He crossed to the counter, picked up his mug, and took a sip with the evaluative attention of someone checking something without wanting to appear to. "It's perfect," he said. It was the same coffee I made every time. He had simply never been the one receiving it before. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the way we did most mornings, the newspaper open between us, the particular domestic quiet of 2 people who have run out of the kind of conversation that needs to be performed. Except that this morning, I had an agenda, and I let it unfold slowly, the way she had taught me to approach a negotiation, not with the thing you want, but with the question that leads there. "I've been thinking," I said, "that I should probably get a clearer picture of where things stand, with the properties." I know Mom had been meaning to walk me through the portfolio properly, and now I let the sentence trail in the direction of grief rather than finish it. He set down his coffee. The shift in his attention was immediate and complete, the way a compass needle swings when it finds north. He leaned forward slightly, not enough to be noticeable, just enough. "That's a good instinct," he said. "Honestly, it's something we should have done sooner. There are a few things in the current structure that need attention. Nothing urgent, but decisions that would go more smoothly with your signature than without." "Of course," I said. "Whatever makes sense." He talked for 20 minutes. About the portfolio, about the structures my mother had put in place, about several transactions he described as pending and time-sensitive. I listened with the focused, slightly overwhelmed expression of a woman trying to absorb practical information while still raw with loss, asked 2 questions that were just specific enough to suggest genuine engagement, and watched him grow more expansive with every exchange. He believed he was winning me over. He was telling me, in careful professional language, exactly what he intended to do. I stored every word. He made the reservation himself, a restaurant on Broad Street that we'd been to on our 2nd anniversary, the kind of place with white tablecloths and low lighting and a wine list presented in a leather folder. A statement I understood, a performance of normalcy, a signal that things were moving in the direction he wanted. I wore the dress my mother had given me for my 30th birthday. Dark green fitted the kind of thing she'd always said I didn't wear often enough. I had taken it from the back of the closet that afternoon and stood holding it for a moment before I put it on. She had watched him from closer than I knew she'd written. She had stayed because I wasn't protected yet. I put the dress on and went downstairs. The restaurant was warm and candlelit and full of the pleasant murmur of other people's evenings. He ordered for both of us without asking, which he always did, and which I had always allowed, because it had seemed once like a form of attentiveness. I sat across from him in the candlelight and looked at his face, really looked without the overlay of everything I had once felt when I looked at him, and found that I could do it without flinching, without grief, without anger, without anything that might register on the surface of my expression. He was just a man at a table. "After everything settles," he said, swirling his wine, "I think we should go to Europe. Take some real time. You've been carrying so much." "That sounds perfect," I said. Under the table with my left hand, I found the prepaid phone in my coat pocket and typed, without looking at the screen, 12 words, plan confirmed, moving forward, 24 hours from tomorrow morning. See, I pressed send and put the phone away and picked up my wine glass. "Where were you thinking?" I asked. "Italy." He smiled, easy, pleased, the smile of a man who believes the situation is resolving in his favor. "Wherever you want," he said. "This is for you." We were home by 10. He went to the kitchen while I hung up my coat, and I heard the sound of a cabinet opening a drawer, the small domestic sounds of an evening winding down. When he appeared in the doorway, he was holding something in his open palm. A single white tablet, small and unmarked, the kind that requires no particular pharmacy packaging when it's never passed through a pharmacy. "I called the doctor today," he said, with the particular warmth he reserved for moments of ostensible care. "Told him how you've been doing. He said this would help with the grief and the anxiety just for the short term while things are unsettled." He held it out, smiled. "Take it with water, sweetheart." He had a client dinner that evening, something he'd mentioned twice over the past week, with the particular casualness of a man establishing an alibi in advance. I had written the time down in my phone and said nothing. That left me the morning. The Charleston waterfront. Before 7 is a different place than it becomes by midday. Quieter, more industrial. The tourist-facing version of itself not yet assembled. Fishing boats running out toward the harbor mouth. Dock workers moving between containers on the far pier. The smell of salt water and diesel. And the particular cold that comes off a tidal river in November. The kind that gets into your coat rather than sitting on top of it. Ray was already at the meeting point when I arrived, a weathered picnic table at the edge of the park where the walking path meets the working waterfront, the kind of location that looks like nothing from a distance. He was not alone. The woman beside him was someone I recognized before I fully placed her the gray coat. The sharp eyes, the unhurried posture of someone entirely at ease in whatever room she occupied. She had been at my mother's funeral 5 days ago, pressing a note into my hand and walking away before I could ask a single question. She looked at me now with the direct, assessing attention of someone who has been waiting for this conversation for a long time. "Your mother trusted me," she said. "I hope you will too." Her name was Margaret Calloway. 28 years with the Bureau, the last 14 of them in financial crimes, working cases that required the particular patience of building evidence over months or years rather than weeks. She had retired 3 years ago, settled in Charleston, and been found by my mother 15 months ago through a contact they shared from the historic preservation community. 2 women who had spent their careers paying close attention to things other people overlooked. "Eleanor came to me because she needed someone who understood what she was dealing with," Margaret said. "Not just the financial piece, the whole architecture of it, how someone like him operates, what evidence would actually hold, and what a case needed to look like before it went anywhere official." She had been the one who identified the federal dimensions. The forged signatures on 7 property contracts moved across state lines, the wire transfers, the pattern of behavior across 3 states and 2 previous marriages that, taken together, constituted something considerably more actionable than a difficult divorce. "That's when we brought in Dana," she said. Ray opened his laptop and turned it toward me. Agent Dana Reyes appeared on the screen with the no preamble directness of someone running a meeting with limited time. Mid-30s dark hair pulled back, the focused expression of a person who has been working a case long enough to have opinions about it. She was calling from what appeared to be a field office, institutional walls, the edge of a whiteboard, visible behind her left shoulder. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "I'll be brief. We've been building a federal case on Ethan Marsh for 18 months. What you've retrieved in the past 4 days fills the last 3 evidentiary gaps we had." She laid it out efficiently. The forged signatures were the clearest: federal hook wire, fraud, identity, fraud, interstate property crimes. The financial trail Ray had documented gave them the pattern. Sarah Connolly's testimony, if she was willing to give it, reopened the Columbia incident as something other than an accident. "What we don't have," Reyes said, "is his voice. His own words on record, confirming that he understood what he was introducing into your mother's medication. Without that, a defense attorney puts everything else in the category of circumstantial." She looked at me steadily through the screen. "That piece has to come from inside the house." The plan, as Ray outlined it, moved on 3 tracks simultaneously. The federal track was already in motion, Reyes and her team, handling the documentary evidence, coordinating with the Columbia field office on the prior incident preparing the warrant applications that would be ready to execute the moment the audio threshold was met. Sarah had agreed, when Ray reached her the previous evening, to provide a formal statement. She would appear in person if it came to that. 4 years of waiting had apparently made the decision straightforward. The third track was mine. Ray didn't elaborate on the specifics. We would cover those separately, he said, when there was less to set up and more to work with. What mattered now was that the house needed to be prepared before he came home from his client dinner. The devices he had installed needed to be located and neutralized. A different kind of equipment needed to take their place, the kind that transmitted outward, rather than inward, to a receiver, in a vehicle parked 2 blocks from King Street, monitored in real time by Reyes's team. "He'll be out of the house for approximately 3 hours, Ray said. "That's enough time." "What do I need to do tonight?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "Be home. Be normal. Let him come back to exactly the situation he expects to come back to." Margaret reached across the table and put her hand, briefly, over mine, a gesture so similar to the one she'd used at the graveside, pressing the note into my palm, that I felt the echo of it move through me. "Your mother built the foundation," she said. "You're the one who gets to finish it." I was halfway back to my car when my phone buzzed. An email. His attorney's address in the sender field, the same firm name I'd seen on the guardianship filing Ray had shown me 2 nights ago. The subject line read, "Notice of Hearing Competency Proceeding." I stopped walking and opened it. The hearing was scheduled for 9 in the morning, 48 hours from today. I stood on the waterfront path, with the river moving behind me, and the city waking up around me, and read the email twice. He had filed the paperwork days ago, yes, but scheduling a hearing this quickly meant he had been pushing for the earliest possible date from the moment he submitted it. He wasn't waiting to see how things developed. He was accelerating, which meant whatever we were doing, we were now doing it in 48 hours, or not at all. Let's stop here for a moment. Not because the story is slowing down, if anything. It's about to move faster than it has since the moment an old woman pressed a folded note into Claire's hand at a graveside, and everything she thought she knew about her life started coming apart at the seams. We're stopping because this is the moment the story turns on. Everything before this, the note, the safe, the medical file, the conversation in a small apartment in West Ashley, with a woman who had spent 4 years watching from a wheelchair and waiting for exactly this, all of it has been building toward the next 48 hours. And before we go there, I want to ask you something. Here is where Claire stands right now. She has a hearing scheduled for 9 in the morning, 48 hours from today. A legal proceeding initiated by her husband's attorneys, built on 4 days of footage he collected of her, moving through her grief in ways that reframed carefully look like instability. Every document she found, every call she made, every moment she spent trying to understand what happened to her mother, all of it recorded, all of it potentially usable against her. He believes she is unraveling. He has watched her through his own cameras and concluded that the woman across the dinner table from him, the one who smiled when he talked about Europe, who nodded when he explained what needed her signature, is a woman in the final stages of giving up. He is by every measure available to him confident. And confidence, as Claire has just begun to understand, is the only leverage she has left. She also has a federal agent, 2 states away, who has spent 18 months building a case and needs one thing she hasn't been able to get from the outside. A former investigator with 2 decades of experience who has been her shadow for 14 months. A woman in West Ashley who has been sitting on 4 years of carefully documented evidence and waiting for someone to finally be in a position to use it. And a plan still forming, still fragile, that depends entirely on her ability to walk back into that house and perform for somewhere between 12 and 24 more hours the role of a woman who suspects nothing and is too overwhelmed by grief to be a threat to anyone. That is what she's been asked to do. That is what everything depends on. Now, if you were her, and I mean really, her, not the version of her, you'd be in a movie where the right choice is obvious and the outcome is never really in doubt, what would you do? Because I think this is genuinely harder than it looks. Option A says, stay. Go back to that house tonight. Sleep in that bed. Sit across that breakfast table one more time. And let him go on believing what he believes right now, that he has already won, that the paperwork is filed, and the clock is running, and all he has to do is wait. Get close enough one more time to let him say the thing that ends it. Trust the people parked 2 blocks away. Trust the plan. Trust yourself. The argument for this is straightforward. It's the only path that produces the specific evidence that turns a complicated civil and criminal case into something airtight. Everything else, the documents, the financial records, Sarah's testimony, builds the frame. His voice, his own words, is the picture inside it. Without that, a skilled defense attorney can spend months creating reasonable doubt out of the gaps between what can be proven and what can only be inferred. Claire knows this. She was told this directly by someone who has spent 18 months working toward exactly that moment. But option B says, leave. Tonight. Don't perform one more dinner. Don't accept one more offered glass of water with a smile. Don't spend one more night in a house where the walls have been watching. Walk out with the prepaid phone and the red USB drive and every document her mother spent 14 months assembling. Hand it to the federal team and let them do what federal teams are built to do. The argument for this is also straightforward. She is not a trained investigator. She is a 31-year-old woman who has been living inside a carefully constructed reality for 4 years and has known the truth of her situation for less than a week. The plan requires her to be, for an extended period of time, in a confined space, with a man who has demonstrated across multiple states, across multiple years, across multiple lives, that he is exceptionally good at reading when the situation around him has shifted. Sarah said it herself. He has a sense for when the ground is moving under him. What happens if he feels it move? I've thought about this more than I probably should have. And here is what I keep coming back to. Claire's mother, Eleanor Whitmore, 61 years old, a woman who spent 30 years building something from nothing, and 14 months protecting it in secret, while her own health was being quietly taken from her, did not leave. She could have. At some point in those 14 months, she could have walked away from the house on Trad Street, contacted Margaret Calloway, handed over everything she had, and let the process work without her in it. She would likely have been safer. She might have had more time. She stayed because she understood something about this particular kind of situation that is easy to miss from the outside, that the evidence that actually ends it, that makes it impossible to reframe or appeal or quietly settle into ambiguity, has to come from inside, has to come from someone close enough to hear the thing he would only ever say when he believed he had already won. She stayed to build something her daughter could finish. The question is whether her daughter is going to finish it. So, before we go any further, option A, stay. Execute the plan. Walk back into that house and let him believe for 48 more hours that he is winning. Option B, leave tonight, hand it over. Trust the system to do the rest without putting herself back in that room. Comment below, A or B, and tell me why you'd make that call. Tell me what you would do if it were you. And then don't go anywhere, because what happens next is the part of this story that Eleanor Whitmore gave everything to make possible. It starts right now. He left for his client dinner at 7:15. I stood at the living room window and watched his car back out of the drive with the particular, unhurried confidence of a man who has no reason to rush, who has in fact every reason to feel that the evening ahead of him is the easy part, the waiting part, the part where the work he has already done simply continues to do itself. The taillights disappeared around the corner. I sent Ray one word clear. He arrived 12 minutes later, a van marked with a plumbing company's logo parked at the curb, the kind of vehicle that belongs on a residential street at any hour without drawing attention. Ray came through the back garden entrance with a second man I hadn't met, introduced only as a technical specialist, who carried a soft-sided case and moved through the house with the systematic efficiency of someone who has done this in more complicated circumstances than a 3-story Charleston single. I sat at the kitchen table and let them work. Ray had given me the count from his prior surveillance, 6 devices total. 2 on the ground floor, 1 in the living room, positioned to cover the main seating area. 1 in the kitchen, aimed at the table, where we took most of our meals. 2 on the second floor, the hallway and the master bedroom doorway. 2 more that had required closer examination to locate built into the frames of objects that had been in the house long enough that their presence had become invisible. A clock on the mantel, a small decorative piece on the upstairs landing that I had always assumed came with the house. It had not come with the house. The technical specialist worked without speaking. Ray stood in the doorway of each room while the sweep happened, and when it was finished, he came back to the kitchen and set 6 small objects on the table in front of me, each no larger than a shirt button, each one a version of ordinary that I would never have thought to question. "All of them," he said. I looked at them for a moment. 6 small things. 4 years of marriage and 6 small things placed in the rooms where I had believed I was alone. "The replacements are in," Ray continued. "Audio only, no visual. Transmitting directly to Agent Reyes's team. They'll be monitoring in real time starting at 6 tomorrow morning." He paused. "Claire, you don't have to do this the way we discussed. If tomorrow morning comes and it doesn't feel right, you walk out. Reyes has enough to move forward on the federal charges regardless." "I know," I said. "But I know," I said again. "I'll be ready." He looked at me for a moment with the assessing attention I had come to recognize as his version of concern. Then he picked up the 6 small objects, put them in his jacket pocket, and left the way he'd come. I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and did not sleep. He came home at 11:40. I was in bed, eyes closed, breathing slow. He moved through the house with his usual efficiency, doors, locks, lights, and was asleep within 20 minutes. I lay in the dark and went through it one more time. Not the plan itself, which I had reviewed until it had stopped feeling like a plan and started feeling like something that had already happened and simply needed to be allowed to occur. Something else, something smaller and more specific, the particular quality of stillness required to perform grief convincingly in front of a man who had spent 4 years learning to read my face. The useful thing, the thing I hadn't anticipated, was that I didn't need to manufacture much. I was exhausted. I had not slept properly in 5 days. My hands, when I held them in front of me in the dark, had a faint tremor that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the accumulated weight of what I had learned and carried and not yet been able to set down. My eyes by morning would be what they were, the eyes of a woman who had been awake since before the sun. That was enough. That was, in fact, exactly right. He needed to see a woman at the end of her resources, and I was in every way that could be seen precisely that. The difference, the only difference, was what was happening underneath. He came downstairs at 7:30 to find me at the kitchen table. I had been there since 5. I had not made coffee. I had not turned on any lights. I sat in the gray morning with my hands around a glass of water I hadn't drunk and my hair still from yesterday, and my eyes doing exactly what 5 days without proper sleep produces in a person who has been trying very hard not to feel everything she is feeling. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. I looked up at him, and I let my face do what it had been doing all morning when no one was watching, which was simply the truth of where I was, slightly opened, slightly unguarded, not performed, not calculated, just allowed. "Hey," he said, and his voice shifted immediately into the register he used for management, warm, careful, the tone of a man who has assessed a situation and knows exactly how to enter it. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands on my shoulders, and I let him pull me against him. And I said into the front of his shirt, "I don't know what's real anymore." He held on tighter. "I've got you," he said. "I'm right here, behind my closed eyes." I counted to 3. Then I pulled back just enough to look up at him. Let the exhaustion show. Let the edges of things be soft and uncertain, the way they would be for a woman who had just said something true for entirely different reasons than he believed. He reached into his pocket and held out what he'd been carrying since the previous morning, the same small white tablet, the same open palm, the same expression of careful, practiced solicitude. I looked at it. Then I looked at his face. Then I did the thing that required of everything I had done in the past 5 days, the most precise calibration. I shook my head, not in refusal, but in the way of someone who is past the point of managing small things. And I said, "Will you just sit with me? I need to talk." Something moved behind his eyes, quick, almost imperceptible. A recalculation. Then it was gone, replaced by the expression he wore when he was certain of the terrain. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, settled back, unhurried. The posture of a man who has been waiting for this moment and is in no rush now that it has arrived. "Of course," he said. "I'm listening." I folded my hands on the table, looked at them, then looked at him. "Ethan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." He held my gaze without hesitation, nodded once. "Always, sweetheart," he said. I started with the smallest thing I could think of. "Tell me about the last few weeks," I said. "With her. You were over there more than I was. I was working, and you were always so good about checking in on her. I just keep thinking about whether she seemed okay. At the end." He looked at me across the table with the careful attention of a man gauging depth before he steps. "She seemed comfortable," he said. "As comfortable as she could be, given everything." "Was she in any pain?" "The doctors managed it well." I nodded, looked down at my hands, let a silence develop, not a challenging silence, just the natural pause of a woman trying to find the shape of something she needs to say. "She took so many things," I said. "Medications, I mean. By the end, I could never keep track of all of it." "That's normal," he said. "At that stage. You helped with that, didn't you? Making sure she had what she needed." I looked up at him with the expression of someone seeking comfort in a detail. "I always thought that was so kind, that you took that on." Something in him eased. I watched it happen. The slight release in the set of his shoulders, the fractional shift from guardedness into a more settled arrangement. He had heard what he expected to hear. A grieving woman reaching for evidence of her husband's goodness because she needed to believe in it right now. "She needed consistency," he said. "Someone making sure things were handled properly. You had enough to manage. She was lucky to have you," I said. He accepted that with a small nod, magnanimous, certain. I asked 2 more questions, in the same register, soft personal. The questions of a daughter, trying to reconstruct her mother's last weeks through someone else's eyes. He answered each one with the measured generosity of a man who believes he is being kind. And then I let the silence go longer than was comfortable. It stretched across the kitchen table between us, 10 seconds, 15. And I watched him, the way Ray had taught me, to watch not at the eyes, but at the hands, at the small adjustments people make when silence asks something of them. His fingers moved against the table. Once. "She was a complicated woman," he said. Not prompted, just offered into the space the silence had made. "Your mother, she cared about you deeply, but she made things more difficult than they needed to be." I kept my expression soft, curious. "What do you mean?" "She had a hard time letting go of control, of the properties of the finances, of you." A pause. "She didn't trust easily." "She trusted you," I said. The look that crossed his face was brief and very specific, the flicker of something that was not quite contempt and not quite amusement, existing for less than a second before it was covered. "She tolerated me," he said, "because she understood that you needed me to be part of things. But she kept interfering in decisions that weren't hers to make anymore." "Interfering how?" He looked at me, assessing the same calculation I had watched him run 100 times, the quick internal arithmetic of risk versus reward. What she knows versus what she's asking. How much to give. The confidence won. It always did in the end, with people who believed they had already secured the outcome. I gave her every opportunity to step back gracefully, he said, to let the transition happen the way it needed to happen. She chose not to take it. The kitchen was very quiet. "What did you do?" I asked. My voice was the same as it had been, quiet, a little lost. The voice of a woman asking a question she thinks she already knows the answer to and hopes she's wrong. He held my gaze for 4 seconds. Then, something in him made a decision. I could see it happen the moment the calculation completed and came down on the side of, "It doesn't matter anymore. She's already past the point of being a problem." And he said, "I managed the situation. Her doctor should have been monitoring her more carefully. That's a medical failure, not mine." He said it the way you say something you have rehearsed until it stopped feeling like a lie and started feeling like a position. The room was completely still. I looked down at the table for a moment. Then I looked up at him, and this time I let my face do something different. Not soft, not lost, just direct. The kind of direct that doesn't require explanation. "Did you love me at all?" I said. "Even at the beginning? Or was it always just the properties?" The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. I counted them. Then he smiled. Not the smile I had seen 1,000 times. The warm, practiced husband smile that had once made me feel chosen. This was something else. Smaller, realer. The smile of a man who has decided in the last 30 seconds that the performance is over and he no longer needs to maintain it. "Claire," he said, almost gently, "you were never the point. The Whitmore Trust was." My phone buzzed once against my thigh. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. I had agreed with Ray on a single vibration for go to, for stand down, and I had felt the shape of this conversation moving toward its conclusion for the past 9 minutes with the specific certainty of something that has been set in motion and cannot now be stopped. I pressed the screen once to confirm receipt without removing the phone from my pocket. Then I stood up. He blinked, the first unguarded thing he had done since sitting down, a flicker of genuine surprise at the shift in my posture, in the arrangement of my expression, in the version of me that was suddenly standing across the kitchen table from him. "Thank you," I said, "for being honest." His eyes narrowed. The smile faded. Something moved behind his face, the first real thing I had seen there in 4 years, and I watched him begin to understand that the ground had shifted somewhere beneath him, and he had not felt it move. "Claire," the sound came from the front of the house. 3 impacts, hard, deliberate, the kind that are designed to be heard through walls and across floors and into every room of a building at once. And then a voice, flat, authoritative, the voice of someone who has said these words before and will say them again and means every syllable of them. "FBI, open the door." The front door opened before anyone knocked again. Not because he opened it, because I did. I walked through the living room with the particular steadiness of someone who has been moving toward a specific moment for 5 days and has finally arrived at it, turned the deadbolt, and pulled the door back to find 3 people on the front porch of the house on King Street, Agent Reyes in person, for the first time, shorter than I'd expected, and considerably more certain, flanked by 2 agents in jackets with lettering across the back that made the nature of the visit unambiguous. She looked at me. I stepped aside. He was still at the kitchen table when they came through. I don't know what I had expected, some version of the composure he'd maintained for 4 years perhaps, or the immediate pivot to charm that I had watched him deploy in every difficult moment of our marriage. What I found instead was something I hadn't seen before, a man in the process of rapidly recalculating his eyes, moving from Agent Reyes to the agents behind her, to me, and finding no version of the arithmetic that worked. Then his face did something it had never done in front of me. It went still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his presentation. The stillness of a machine that has encountered an input it wasn't built to process. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then he looked at me, and what came into his expression was something that I recognized in a distant way as the first completely honest thing he had ever directed at me. "You set me up," he said. I held his gaze across the kitchen. You set yourself up, I said. I just stopped looking away. He tried. I'll say that for him, he tried with the specific and practiced skill of a man who has talked his way out of difficult rooms before and believed until the last possible moment that this room was no different. He turned to Agent Reyes with an expression assembled from equal parts confusion and concern and said, in the voice he used when he wanted to appear reasonable, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My wife has been struggling significantly since her mother's passing. There are documented concerns about her mental state. Her attorney can confirm. Sir, Reyes said. Her voice carried the flat, absolute patience of someone who has heard every variation of this particular speech and has long since stopped finding it interesting. Turn around. He turned. His wrists were secured with the quiet efficiency of people who do this as a matter of routine. He was walked through the living room past the couch where we had watched television on 100 ordinary evenings, past the mantel where one of his devices had been hidden inside a clock I had never thought to question, and through the front door. He didn't look back. He made one more attempt in the garage. I learned this afterward from Ray, who had been in the vehicle 2 blocks away and monitored the feeds throughout. Something in him, in those final seconds between the kitchen and the front porch, had identified the garage as a possible exit, a calculation so fast and so habitual that it had apparently operated below the level of conscious decision. He moved toward it. The door responded to the remote entry code the way it always had. The gate at the end of the drive did not. Ray had locked it from his laptop at 7:53 that morning, 17 minutes before I sat down across the kitchen table and asked my first quiet question. He had simply been waiting to see if it would be needed. It was needed for approximately 45 seconds. Then it wasn't. 3 weeks later, I sat in the 3rd row of a federal courtroom and watched Sarah Connolly wheel herself to the front of the room. She had called me the evening before, not to discuss what she planned to say, but to tell me she was ready, and that she had been ready for 4 years, and that the only thing that had changed was that someone was finally in a position to hear it. I had thanked her. She had told me not to, that she was doing it for the same reason I had stayed in that house for one more night, which was that some things need to be finished. She spoke for 22 minutes without notes and without hesitation. She described a marriage and the particular incremental way it had been dismantled from the inside. She described a bridge on a wet night and what she had seen through a hospital window when she woke up. She described 4 years of watching and waiting and documenting from a ground floor apartment in West Ashley. And she described the moment she opened her door to find me on the other side of it and what it had meant to her after 4 years of no one coming. She did not run a single word. The courtroom was very quiet throughout. The recording was entered into evidence on the second day. 9 minutes and 43 seconds of audio from the kitchen of a house on King Street played through the courtroom's speaker system at a volume that made every word entirely clear. The quality was good. Ray's technical specialist had been thorough, and every person in that room heard without ambiguity or static a man's voice explaining that he had managed a situation that a doctor's failure to monitor properly was not his responsibility, and that the woman sitting across from him at the time had never been the point. The defense attorney made a note on his legal pad. He did not look up. It was over by 3:15 in the afternoon. I sat in the 3rd row and listened to the proceedings conclude with the specific, unhurried formality of a system that has arrived at a finding and is taking the appropriate time to record it properly. The room began to empty, with the gradual, subdued movement of people who have been present at something significant and aren't sure yet how to carry it back out into the ordinary world. A hand on my arm. My attorney, a careful, precise woman named Helen, who had been recommended by Margaret and had handled the Whitmore Trust documentation with the same quiet thoroughness my mother would have appreciated, leaned close and spoke in the low register she used when the information was important and the setting was not private. The judge has scheduled the Whitmore Trust reading for Thursday, she said. There's one more thing your mother included that I think you should know about before you go in." She held a sealed envelope. My name was on the front in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Thursday came in clear and cold, sharp blue sky air that actually moved the kind of Charleston morning that makes everything look more defined than usual. I had the envelope in my coat pocket when I walked into the courthouse. I had not opened it. I wanted to read it in the right room. The Whitmore Trust reading was scheduled for 9 o'clock in a smaller courtroom than the one where the criminal proceedings had concluded, a narrower space, functional rather than formal, the kind of room where the legal architecture of a life gets processed without ceremony. His attorney was already seated when I arrived. Helen sat beside me. The judge, a woman in her 60s, with the unhurried authority of someone who has seen everything a courtroom produces, took her seat and opened the proceedings without preamble. The trust document ran to 41 pages. The court-appointed reader moved through it with methodical patience, and as the relevant sections accumulated, the picture my mother had spent 16 months constructing in secret became visible in its entirety for the first time. Every asset, the property on Trad Street, the King Street portfolio, the Whitmore building on East Bay, purchased at a price everyone had called too high, appreciated over decades, to a value that had vindicated her judgment entirely. 30 years of careful, conviction-driven work, all of it in the trust, none of it accessible to anyone whose name was not Claire Eleanor Whitmore. His attorney rose at the appropriate moment and made the appropriate objection: spousal interest, procedural irregularities, contested classification. The tone of a man performing a required task without expectation of success. The judge listened, made a note. The trust documentation is in order. The restructuring was executed 16 months ago by a licensed attorney in good standing, properly filed and recorded. Objection overruled. His attorney sat down and wrote something on his legal pad, the same pad on which he'd made a note when the recording was played 3 weeks ago, and had not looked up. Helen handed me the second envelope during the brief recess. My mother had been specific about sequence, which pieces were to be presented in what order. Helen had followed her instructions exactly. I unfolded 2 pages of cream stationery, not the letter I had found in the safe. Something written later, dated 3 weeks before she passed, with instructions that it be read on this specific occasion. Claire, by the time you read this, you will already know most of what I wanted to tell you. I hope you'll forgive me for not saying it sooner, and in person, the way it should have been said. I watched you love someone who didn't deserve it. I watched you stay, not because you were weak, not because you couldn't see, but because you believed in the good in people and gave that belief everything you had. That is not a flaw, my darling. That is the best of you. Don't let him take it. Don't let any of this make you smaller or harder or less willing to trust. The world needs people who lead with openness. It just also needs them to know that trust is not the same as blindness, and love is not the same as silence. You were never the problem. You were always the point. All my love, always, Mom. I folded the pages along their creases and held them in my lap. The courtroom was very quiet. The sentencing was that afternoon. He was brought in with the flat, contained expression of a man who has completed his calculations and arrived at a number he does not intend to show a reaction to. When the judge read the terms, 2 concurrent life sentences on the most serious counts, 40 years, on the federal charges, to run consecutively, he did not move, did not change the arrangement of his face by any degree that suggested the words had landed anywhere. He had always been good at surfaces, the judge concluded. The room began its gradual emptying. I watched him walk through the side door, same posture, same forward gaze, and then the door closed, and he was simply gone. Ray found the seat beside me when everyone else had left. We sat in the empty courtroom without speaking, the silence of 2 people who have been working toward a specific outcome and have arrived at it simultaneously and are not yet sure what the ordinary world sounds like on the other side. Eventually, your mother was one of the bravest people I've ever worked with. I looked at the pages in my lap. I know, I said. Outside, the afternoon had gone full gold. That specific late November light, that Charleston does better than almost anywhere, warm and horizontal, catching the ironwork along Broad Street and turning everything briefly luminous. I stood on the courthouse steps and did something I didn't notice until I had already done it. I looked straight ahead, not left, not right, not the habitual sweep of a woman who has spent years calibrating herself to the presence of someone always watching. Just ahead, at the street and the light and the ordinary afternoon moving around me in every direction. It was the first time in longer than I could accurately remember. 6 months is not a long time. I know that now. In a way I didn't before. The way you come to know certain things, not through being told, but through living on the other side of them. 6 months is enough time for scaffolding to go up on a 4-story building on King Street. Enough time for paint to dry and floors to be refinished and a sign to be hung above a front door that had been locked for 2 years while the building waited for someone to decide what it was for. It is not enough time to stop reaching for your phone at night to check whether someone has been watching. But it is, I've found enough time to catch yourself doing it, and to put the phone down, and to go back to sleep. The sign went up on a Tuesday in early March, on a morning when the azaleas along King Street were just beginning to consider the idea of color-pale suggestions of pink at the tips of branches that had been bare all winter. 2 men on a lift, a painted board, 45 minutes of work. Whitmore House, a safe place to start over. I stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at it for a long time. My mother had bought the building 11 years ago as an investment, a decision her accountant had questioned and her instincts had overruled, which was, I had come to understand the pattern that had defined most of the good decisions of her life. She had intended eventually to do something with it that mattered. She had not yet decided what. I had decided for her. I thought she would have approved. Sarah arrived at 10, the way she always did, exactly on time, which I had come to understand was her version of the punctuality my mother had practiced, a form of respect expressed through reliability. She came through the front door of Whitmore House and stopped in the entryway, looking at the freshly painted walls and the new flooring and the light coming through the windows that faced the street. Then she stood up. Not fully, not yet. Her right hand on the doorframe. Her left, finding the edge of the reception desk that the volunteers had assembled the previous week. But her right foot flat on the floor. Her right leg taking weight. Her body arranged in the architecture of standing rather than the architecture of being seated. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then she sat back down and looked at me with an expression that was trying very hard not to be the thing it clearly was. 2 more months, she said. They think I'll walk with a cane by summer. I didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her. I'll believe it when I see it, I said. She laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, the laugh of someone who has spent 4 years not having very much to laugh about and is still slightly surprised when it happens. Diane landed at Charleston Executive at noon and was at the building by 1:15, still carrying her overnight bag, because she had come directly from the airport, which was the kind of thing she had always done, the direct route, the immediate arrival, no stops between deciding and doing. We stood outside on the sidewalk under the azaleas, and she looked at the sign and then at me, and I watched her face do the complicated thing it had been doing since I called her 6 months ago, with the version of events I had promised myself I would tell her completely and without softening. I thought I was protecting you, she said, by leaving. I thought if I wasn't there, he couldn't use me against you. I know, I said. I should have stayed. He was counting on you, thinking that, I said. He was counting on everyone around me, making the reasonable protective choice. That's how it works. That's what makes it so effective. She was quiet for a moment. Then she put her arm around me, the way she had at the airport years ago. The same hold, the same quality of contact that meant something more than the gesture itself. And we stood there on King Street in the March sunshine and let it be what it was. Margaret came by in the late afternoon with 2 coffees in paper cups, the way she had taken to doing on Tuesdays, since the building work began, dropping in, without announcement, staying for 20 minutes, departing with the same unhurried certainty with which she did everything. We sat on the front steps while the last of the day's workers packed up inside. She said something to me, Margaret offered, the first time we met. Your mother. She held her cup in both hands and looked out at the street. She said, I don't need you to save my daughter. I just need you to help me give her the tools to save herself. I looked at the sign above the door. That sounds like her, I said. It was very her, Margaret agreed. We finished our coffee. She patted my hand, once stood up with the ease of a woman who has stayed in good shape out of habit rather than vanity, and walked back down King Street toward wherever she was going next. By 5 o'clock, I was alone in the building. I went upstairs, second floor, the room that would eventually be a resource library, currently empty except for paint cans and a folding table, and the particular smell of new plaster that I had come to associate with the specific satisfaction of a thing being built. The window faced east toward the harbor, and in the early evening of a clear March day, the light that came off the water was the color of something between gold and copper, warm and specific, and entirely itself. Charleston Harbor, the same water my mother had looked at her whole life, the same water visible from the painting she had carried from house to house for 40 years, because it reminded her of what she was working toward. I stood at the window and looked at it for a long time, without thinking about anything in particular, without cataloging the room behind me, or monitoring the sounds from downstairs, or calculating the distance between where I was standing and the nearest exit, without any of the small, constant, invisible work of a person who has learned to exist in a state of sustained alertness. Just the water, just the light, just the ordinary evening doing what ordinary evenings do. My mother's voice arrived the way it always did now, not as grief, not as absence, but as something closer to company, a presence that had learned to travel light. Don't let him see you cry. The last instruction, the one I had carried through every room of that house on King Street, through every careful smile and every long night and every moment of sitting across a table, from a man who had looked at me and seen an obstacle between himself and what he wanted. He never saw me cry. Not once. Not when he handed me tea. I didn't drink or offered me tablets I pocketed and disposed of, or sat across from me under candlelight and talked about Europe with the easy confidence of a man who believed the ending was already written. What he saw at the very end, with his hands behind his back and the morning light coming through the windows of the home he thought he'd won, was me. Just me. Finally,